Here's your wrestling news for April 6, 2021. And if you like what you're watching, smash that like button and give us 1,000 likes or more. And your headlines for today include: major heel turn happens on Raw. Huge entrance promised for WrestleMania. Changes made, more matches added to this weekend's card. Which match will open up WrestleMania 37? Spoiler on Universal title match result. I want to wrestle. Current superstar threatens to leave WWE. WWE's plans for fans who try to hijack WrestleMania revealed. Where was the Fiend and Alexa Bliss during last night's Raw? Why did Drew McIntyre take such a beating against King Corbin? Who says he'd take the call? WWE legend shoots down Punk return rumors. The Fiend Bray Wyatt in hot water with WWE? What's wrong with Raw's tag team division? He's frustrated. AEW star reveals real reason new tag team was formed. WWE backtracks on third-party rule, superstars return to Cameo, and more. We're kicking off today with news from Raw, and there was a lot to digest during last night's WrestleMania Go-Home show, and that included a major heel turn. After Rhea Ripley accepted a non-title match last week on behalf of Asuka, the pair faced women's tag champs Nia Jax and Shayna Baszler, and the Australian showed she's not on Raw to make friends. During the match, Ripley intentionally attacked Asuka and cost her team the match with Shayna Baszler pinning the Raw Women's Champion. Given how little build the Raw Women's title matches had, we're pleased Ripley's heel turn has given some fire to the storyline ahead of the biggest match of her career. Whether fans will boo the popular former NXT Women's Champion this weekend remains to be seen, but WWE are clearly defining Ripley as the heel and Asuka as the face for this match. As a heel, Ripley will be entering WrestleMania with a bad attitude and a great entrance. It's been confirmed that Ash Costello will perform Ripley's theme "This Is My Brutality" as she makes her way to the ring for her match against Raw Women's Champion Asuka. Traditionally, WWE have saved live music entrances for their top stars like CM Punk, Triple H, and Randy Orton, and now Rhea Ripley will join that esteemed list. Ripley's heel turn and the musical announcement weren't the only big announcements from Raw, as Bad Bunny made a major change to his WrestleMania match with The Miz. On Raw, Bunny and Damian Priest revealed that this will now be a tag team match pitting the two of them against Miz and Morrison. This was the original plan until a knee injury to Morrison forced WWE to make it a singles match, and we're pleased that Priest will get his WrestleMania debut this year. This also means it'll be 3 people in the ring able to keep Bunny safe instead of 1, and time will tell who emerges victorious in this star-studded match. This week also saw 2 more matches announced for WrestleMania, as the women's tag team titles will be on the line. WWE have confirmed that on night 1, a women's tag team turmoil will determine the number 1 contenders for the women's tag team championships, and that the winner of that match will face Nia Jax and Shayna Baszler on night 2. The first match will feature Natalya and Tamina, Billie Kay and Carmella, Lana and Naomi, and the Riot Squad. Strangely, WWE's announcement didn't include the team of Dana Brooke and Mandy Rose, and we'll have to see if WWE adds any more teams before this Saturday's show. With 2 nights to fill, WWE has a lot planned for this year's show, and the company could be kicking off the festivities in a major way. During Wrestling Observer Live, Bryan Alvarez noted that he believes WWE Champion Bobby Lashley vs. Drew McIntyre will open up this year's event, something that McIntyre has told WWE he'd love to do. This wouldn't be the first time WrestleMania would open with a world title match, as they did that at Manias 27, 28, and 35. Having Lashley vs. McIntyre open the show makes a lot of sense, as the crowd is likely to be very excited over their first WWE event in over a year, and that means both men will be guaranteed huge pops. As for which match will main event night 1 in their place is unclear, but fans can expect WrestleMania to open up in a huge way. Do you think Lashley vs. McIntyre should open WrestleMania, or should it headline night 1? Let us know in the comments. We are far more confident that the Universal title will close night 2 of WrestleMania 37, and fans should expect a new champion to be crowned. That's according to the betting odds, which list Edge as the current favorite to leave Raymond James Stadium with the title, with him having even odds. Roman Reigns is the second favorite to retain the title, whilst Daniel Bryan is once again the underdog and is expected to take the pinfall from either of his 2 opponents. Of course, WWE may be planning to surprise everyone, and there's a lot of factors going into this match, but if the odds are to be believed, the Rated R superstar will cement his return by winning his 12th world title this Sunday. One person fans won't see this weekend is Nikki Cross, who hasn't been seen on TV in quite some time. From opening WrestleMania 36 last year, Cross's star has fallen considerably, and she'd made it clear that she's tired of not being used in the ring. This continued this week when she listed all that she could do since WWE refuses to use her, but what she wants is to wrestle. "I've got my bachelor's, I'm halfway through my master's, I'll get a PhD if I want to. I'm a qualified personal trainer and gym instructor. Heck, I could teach a spin class if I wanted to, but I want what I want. I want to wrestle, I want to entertain, it's what I was born to do." This caught the attention of Charlotte Flair, who's also not booked for WrestleMania, who showed her support with a series of emojis. The reasons why Cross and Flair aren't being used are very different, as we know why Charlotte isn't being used this Sunday, and we can only hope WWE starts using Cross again before it's too late. Since August last year, WWE has hosted their events from the Thunderdome, and whilst it can't match the excitement of a real-life crowd, there have been some benefits for the company. Thanks to the Thunderdome, WWE have had full control of crowd reactions, ensuring that heels are booed and faces cheered, but that won't be the case this weekend at WrestleMania. Despite the risk of live fans going against what WWE are hoping though, the company isn't worried about this, as Ringside News has learned that there's been no discussions about concern over who fans will cheer and boo for. To be fair, WWE's own booking has helped them out, as they won't have to worry about fans booing Roman Reigns, in the past one of the most loathed babyfaces, now that he's a heel. Some fans have even theorized that WWE broke up the Hurt Business because they didn't want the faction cheered over Drew McIntyre when he faces WWE Champion Bobby Lashley. A year after fans last attended, we expect crowds to have plenty of pent-up chants, but for now, WWE aren't worried, or are perhaps too busy to worry about who the crowd will cheer and boo. Back to Raw, and given that the show was the last edition of the Red brand before WrestleMania, we're surprised by two notable absences. Despite the Randy Orton vs. The Fiend match being one of the most anticipated matches, neither Wyatt nor Alexa Bliss were at Raw last night. We're not saying that Wyatt and Orton should have come to blows, but some sort of showdown between the two should have happened on what's supposed to be the most important Raw of the year. It's crazy to think that on a 3-hour show, the writers had no time for some of the most popular stars ahead of the biggest event of WWE's calendar. Even if there'd been just another mind game played by Bliss and Wyatt, that would have been better than what we got, as having the pair be absent from the go-home Raw before Mania only served to cool off some of the excitement going into this weekend. One man who did appear on Raw was Baron Corbin, though we think things would have been better had he stayed away. After all, MVP has made it clear that the King isn't part of the Hurt Business, and though McIntyre silenced Corbin in Raw's main event, the SmackDown superstar got far more offense than expected. Corbin is a fine enough hand in the ring, but the fact that he got so much in against the #1 contender for the WWE Championship 5 days before WrestleMania had us scratching our heads. Each November, WWE sells Survivor Series as the one night you'll see interpromotional matches, but between Corbin and the women's tag team titles, that simply isn't the case. Whilst WWE Champion Bobby Lashley fared much better than his Mania opponent, demolishing Cedric Alexander, fans are still confused as to why WWE split the Hurt Business up in the first place. Are you more excited to see Lashley vs. McIntyre after this week's Raw? Let us know in the comments. One person who knows all about entering WrestleMania as WWE Champion is CM Punk, who some fans would still like to see return. Since leaving over 7 years ago, Punk's only appearances on WWE programming were on Fox's WWE Backstage, and that could have led to a more permanent return. That's according to Triple H, who spoke this week on the Pardon My Take podcast, who revealed that there were offers put out for Punk to return. He said, "Punk worked with us on the Fox show, a year ago? There was opportunities there. There were people around each other at all times. I'll never say never, but the desire needs to be there on all sides to make that happen." When asked, Triple H said that if CM Punk called WWE about a possible return, then he'd definitely take the call, but that this wouldn't guarantee any kind of return. "What says if we make the call he wants to answer? What says if we make the call he doesn't go like, yeah, I'm not interested in doing that anymore. Maybe he's just done with it." Being done with it is the attitude Punk has had since his 2014 departure, as he's made it clear he doesn't want to work with WWE again, but that won't stop fans hoping to see one last match from the best in the world. One man who knows Punk well is Bray Wyatt, and although The Fiend is one of WWE's hottest superstars currently, that wasn't always the case. For much of 2018 and early 2019, Wyatt was gone from TV, and this week, a report stated that his absence was a punishment from WWE. That report stated that Wyatt's very public divorce and WWE being dragged into the proceedings to disclose his earnings earned Wyatt major heat backstage, but that simply isn't the case. When Ringside News asked around about this report, they confirmed that none of it was true, with a tenured writer in WWE calling the piece clickbait and said it was troubling how many people believe fake stories that affect the lives of superstars and their families. What we do know is that Wyatt returned after a lengthy absence as the leader of the Firefly Funhouse and has gone on to become one of WWE's most popular stars, something we doubt the company would have allowed had these claims of backstage heat been real. Back to Raw, and this week's show saw AJ Styles versus Xavier Woods in a rematch from last week, which had some strange booking to say the least. Whilst fans expected Omos to interfere, that didn't happen thanks to Kofi Kingston, and instead, Woods got the clean win with a roll-up. Traditionally, whoever stands tall on the Raw before Mania usually comes up short at the show itself, and we expect this will be the case for the New Day. If Styles and Omos do win, it'll make Styles a Grand Slam champion just 5 years after his WWE debut. And whilst that's an impressive accomplishment, it also highlights the lack of depth in Raw's tag team picture. With the Hurt Business dissolved, it seems that the New Day have no challengers left at all, and Omos and Styles, who are little more than a put-together makeshift team, are their only threats. A win for Styles and Omos will be historic, as it'll give Styles the Grand Slam win and Omos a championship in his first match. But with such little depth to the Raw tag title picture, we wouldn't be surprised if Styles and Omos drop the titles back to the New Day after WrestleMania. But what do you think of Raw's tag team division? Sound off in the comments. Over to AEW now, and as the company seems to add more teams and factions every week, one team has come together for a very interesting reason. In the latest episode of Wrestling with the Week, Scorpio Sky discussed his team with Ethan Page to his co-host James Willems, and said that they were put together because both men have been frustrated with their roles in the company. Sky noted how AEW were courting Page for a very long time, but after signing him, shifted their focus to Christian Cage instead. I went to him when I saw he was already, a couple weeks in, he was a little bit frustrated. I said, "Hey, listen, I know how you feel, let's talk about it." It'll be interesting to see if Page and Sky can channel their frustrations into becoming AEW World Tag Team Champions, but for now, neither man is too happy with how things are going. We're ending today with WWE, who barred all third-party deals last year, forcing dozens of superstars to close down their Cameo accounts. Now though, those superstars will get one more week, as WWE have partnered with a personalized video website during WrestleMania week. Names that'll be available for a video include Shane McMahon, Randy Orton, AJ Styles, and 24 other superstars. Whilst WWE's rule against third-party deals didn't mean superstars had to close their accounts, it did mean superstars had to sign over all their earnings to the company. It's not known what kind of compensation setup WWE has for its superstars at this time, but for now, you can buy a video from a WWE superstar in time for WrestleMania. Well guys, that's our news for today. Please share your comments below. Also hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to receive all notifications. And as always, thanks for watching.